Did you know that giving an inaugural lecture is not a requirement? And so eminently sensible people might not choose to do so. But actually seeing you all here suggests that I made the right decision, and it's really lovely to see you all here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about joints. I love this photo. It's okay, he's in the room, and you can all look around and find out who he is. I might move around a bit, so I might sort of move up here. People over there are people sitting over there. The reason we're in this lecture theatre is because, as part of the Envision project, I was responsible for helping with some of the development of new teaching spaces, and this was an old civil engineering lab with a big pillar in the middle, so they thought they would make a feature of it and put an even bigger staircase there as well. So there you go. I'm giving a lecture to two sets of people here. So I'm going to talk about the mechanics of joints, and I'm going to focus on the knee and the shoulder, and I'll start with the knee. Although being pushed around isn't a luxury all of us have available to us all the time, we therefore need to find out what the knee actually is for, not just for sitting and crossing your legs. So I'm going to start with the tibiofemoral joint of the knee. And the tibiofemoral joint is the joint between the thigh bone and the shin bone. And that's the cartoon. Whenever you see that, that's the joint I'm talking about. Why do we have a knee? Well, if we didn't have a knee, we would walk with straight legs, and our centre of mass would move up and down. And that takes a lot of energy, and that's a waste of energy. So we have a joint in the middle of our leg that allows us to walk with a crouched gait. I'm not telling the jokes are on screen. And it allows us to walk with a crouched gait, so we can keep our centre of mass fairly low. So how does it achieve this? Well, this is a plastic thigh bone, and it's like a cylinder rolling on a flat surface. And the flat surface is the top of your shin bone, and the cylinder is your thigh bone. And so it rolls around, and that's how it achieves the flexion angle that you need. And if we twist it around, you'll see it's like a cylinder with a bit taken out of the middle. And that bit taken out of the middle is important. We'll talk about that later. So this is a graph, and along the bottom is when you hit your heel on the ground, and then your foot leaves the ground, and your leg swings, and then it hits the ground again. And so your knee flexes from the straight by about 70 degrees during walking, and a bit more during running. So how does it achieve that motion? So we have a flat surface that's being pulled relative to this cylinder. And the muscles do that, and the muscles are key here, and I'll talk a lot about muscles. So the hamstring muscles, those muscles at the back of your leg, will pull the shin bone, the tibia, backwards. But of course, if it pulls a bit harder, it'll just dislocate. Yeah, it'll pull the joint apart. So there must be something there to resist that motion. There's no pin-jointed structure there, as some of you first-year engineers know about, to provide a pivot. There are some other structures there, and these are called ligaments. And ligaments are like elastic bands that join one bone to the next, and when you stretch them, they resist that stretching and they pull things back. So we have structures called ligaments that tether the motion of the joint. Okay, so now we have a pivot. And this is cut through the middle of the knee, and we can see a couple of those ligaments here, tethering the motion, providing a pivot point. And there are 4 of these main ligaments in the knee, and this is looking down at the end of our cylinder with the middle bit cut out. And we've got these crossed ligaments called the cruciate ligaments, and ligaments on the side called the collateral ligaments. So they guide the motion, they tether the motion of the knee. Now we're going to move to the other joint of the knee. So how does our knee straighten after it's been bent by the hamstrings? So our big thigh muscles at the front pull the leg straight. The motion is tethered at the tibiofemoral joint, so that's fine. And the capacity of these muscles to pull and to straighten the leg is a factor that's dependent on the size of the muscles and how strong they are, but also the distance they are from the center of rotation of the joint. Yeah, it's a torque, it's a moment. Okay. Now, we all know the knee doesn't look like that from the side. We have something called a kneecap, which actually increases the moment, or the torque. So without increasing the muscle size, you can increase the ability of your leg to straighten by having a big, fat kneecap. And that's why we've got one. So the kneecap slides down the cylinder at the end of your knee. And the muscle forces pull down to the shin, and the thigh muscles pull the kneecap into this groove very tight. So this joint is different from the tibiofemoral joint. The tibiofemoral joint has joint surfaces that are incongruent. They would dislocate without the tethering effect of ligaments. The patellofemoral joint is different because it doesn't need ligaments in the same way. It just needs big muscles to pull it down into the groove. So the geometry and the muscles provide the stability of the joint. So it's very different. So now I'm going to go to my third joint, my third example, and I'm afraid I'm not just talking about walking here. We have many different uses. This thing stopped working. This is me a number of years ago, and perhaps later on this evening when I can relax. You can see we use our upper limb for many useful things. As we raise our arm, there are lots of motions that occur with the shoulder blade and the humerus, and that joint there is called the glenohumeral joint, and it's the joint between the shoulder blade and your upper arm. And it has a large range of motion. So let's go again and look at the shape of the joint surfaces and see how it achieves that motion. So what we have is we have a spherical head of the upper arm, and this is a hip joint here, and that similarly has a spherical head. But the hip joint has a cup into which the spherical head fits. So when you rotate it, it doesn't want to dislocate because the geometry is holding it together. But in the shoulder, the flat surface of my shoulder blade is the surface on which my upper arm articulates. So that's highly unstable again. It's like the cylinder, only worse. It's a sphere sitting on a flat surface. And there are no major ligaments in the shoulder. So there is nothing to tether the motion in the same way as for the knee. But we want to have that. We want to have a center of rotation. We want to be able to lift our arm up. So how do we achieve that? Well, we have a big muscle here on the side called the deltoid, bigger in some than others. And if that were to pull up, it would dislocate the joint. It would pull it up and cause it to twist a little bit, but it would cause it to impinge on the bone there and cause pain. And that's a condition that a number of people in this room have. So what we have is we have some other muscles that are deep into attaching onto the shoulder blade, represented by these red structures here. And those muscles pull sideways and provide a pivot point. So now we have a joint that is stabilized by different muscular contractions. No ligaments, inherently incongruent, but it still manages to spin around. And in fact, these rotator cuff muscles attach all the way around the upper arm, the humerus, so that even when you twist your arm, it doesn't dislocate. It provides stability in all different ranges of motion. So that was background to help you to understand the context for the work that I'm now going to be presenting to you. So we're going to go over some history. So do we all know who this is? This is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. I've actually never seen the film, but that's what I've been told it is. And his medic was Galen, who was a famous anatomist who published a book called On the Function of the Parts, meaning the parts of the human body, and in the 2nd century AD. And so he was the guy who basically formed modern medicine. But actually, he made loads of mistakes in anatomy, particularly, and just got it wrong. So I'm not starting with him. I'm starting with Vesalius. And Vesalius was a Belgian anatomist who really got it right. He got it right with the skeleton. If you read his book, and my group gave me this book last year, and I'm delighted they did. It was translated, by the way. My Latin's not so good. Let's go through what he said. This is in his preface, so I'll just read it out to you. I'll go and stand at the back. So he said, "But in addition, our pictures of the parts of the body will give particular pleasure to those people who do not always have the opportunity of dissecting a human body, or who, if they have the opportunity, are by nature so squeamish, a very inappropriate quality in a physician, that although they are fascinated and delighted by the study of man, which attests, if anything, to the wisdom of the infinite creator of the world, yet they cannot bring themselves to the point of ever actually attending a dissection." And little did you know, you're attending a virtual dissection here. You've already seen some images of anatomy, and you'll see a few more. There's not going to be much blood and guts from here on in, but if you are feeling squeamish, put your head between your knees, sit on the floor. He wrote that in the 16th century in Padua, and so very early on in my story, I was dragged along to Padua. This is St. Anthony's Basilica. My dad's called Tony, I'm called Anthony, so we had the obligatory photo there. And I've been told that it's in these sort of popular lectures, you should also mention a little bit about your own personal history and see if it weaves through. And so this is not tenuous. I did visit Padua, like Vesalius. and I'm flanked by some of my most powerful influences, a recurring theme. And obviously, I still didn't have to use my legs. I was carried still. My knees still haven't found their own use. So, having explained the stability factors of these three main joints, the important factors, we're now going to talk about some of the anatomy studies that I've been involved in to look at those features that are important in the stability. And this image is from Vesalius. So remember, the tibiofemoral joint stability is provided by ligaments. They tether the motion. So the anatomy work took me and my colleagues to looking at these in some detail. So remember, this is the cylinder that rolls around with the bit cut out of the middle. And we'll start with a ligament on the side of the knee. This is the ligament on the inside of your knee, called the medial collateral ligament. And it's generally described as a long, thin structure that resists opening of the joint. So this can be, if you stretch it open, the elastic bands will pull it back, right? But lots of people were considering that it may be slightly different than just having this long, thin structure. There may be other aspects to this ligament that resist other motions, and it's important to investigate that. I'll just do a little aside here. If you rupture a ligament, if your ligament is torn, it is like an elastic band. It pings back, the ends are far apart from each other, and they don't really have a way of getting back together and repairing. So most ligaments do not self-repair. You have to repair them if you rupture them. And what you do is you find out where they insert, you drill tunnels in the bone, and you put in some kind of other material, another elastic band to replace them, of sorts. So it's important not only to describe the anatomy, but to figure out where they insert, where they go on the bones. And so clearly we identified the superficial medial collateral ligament in the same way as people showed here. We peeled that away, and this is now deeper. There's this structure called the deep medial collateral ligament, which is shorter. It still looks like it's going to resist opening of the joint, right, in the same sort of way. And then the third structure, which was ill-described previously in the literature, wraps around the back of this part of the thigh bone. And that's an interesting structure. And having identified where its insertion was, we came up with some hypotheses on its function, and more of that later, associated with twisting of the joint. So this is the cartoon to remind you of the medial collateral ligament when it comes up again. That's the superficial one, just cut in the middle, so you can see the deep one, and then the posterior oblique one is there, the posterior medial capsule. So now we go to this big fat structure in the middle, the anterior cruciate ligament, typically understood as resisting the shear, the translation of the shin bone forward relative to your thigh bone. And this is the one that's frequently ruptured in sporting incidents, where some kind of extreme loading causes the muscles or some other loading to pull the joint apart further than the ligament can resist. And what happens is you end up with a loose joint. Now when your muscles contract, there isn't something to tether anymore, right? So what you do is you end up having to find a way of reconstructing it. You find the point, you drill a tunnel through the bowl, through the holes on either side, and you pull an elastic band through and you reconstruct it. Great. So you have to know where the ligament attachments actually are. And if you're a surgeon doing this, you go through a keyhole, you have a very small incision, you look through a camera, and it's really difficult to find out where it should be inserted and how tight to pull it. So you need to do basic anatomical studies. Where is this structure? Where does it insert? What are the anatomical cues for the clinician to find out where it is? And so we did these kinds of studies. And initially we looked at the whole insertion area on this bone and on this bone. But actually, this structure functions almost like two separate ligaments. It has differential effects. And so it's now frequently reconstructed with two bands. And so we needed to identify clearly where the two bands were. And in this study, we then looked at how we could reconstruct it accurately by drilling tunnels in those places. Okay, so that's an anatomical study on the anterior cruciate ligament. And the final ligament of the knee that I'm going to talk about is called, there are two of them, meniscofemoral ligaments. And this study started during my PhD. So I dissected a knee in my PhD, doing something totally different. This is now the back of the knee. It's twisted round. So that's the front of the cylinder, and this is the back of the cylinder. That's the anterior cruciate ligament, and that one there is that structure there called the posterior cruciate ligament, stopping the shin from being pushed back relative to the thigh. And I saw this structure and didn't know what it was. Of course, other people had described it. There's nothing new under the sun. And it's called the meniscofemoral ligament of Risberg. But nobody really knew what it did. And so I was interested in this, but didn't really have the time or the resource to investigate this. And I'm really proud and pleased that I co-supervised my first PhD student, Chim Gupta, who's here. Lovely to see you, Chim. Who did his whole PhD on these structures. And it's a fantastic story of anatomy first. So he found this structure, found out its prevalence in man. This is now looking again at the cylinder closely, and there's another one of these structures going in front called the anterior meniscofemoral ligament, so there are two of them. And we found that most people have one of these. Not everybody has both. And if we now cut this ligament here, if we now cut this anterior cruciate ligament here, and flex the thigh bone down further, we can see that this meniscofemoral ligament attaches to this structure called the meniscus. And more of that later. We're going to talk about a meniscus in a minute. Let's talk about anatomy of the kneecap. Now, I told you that the muscles pull it into the groove. So the groove is very important, and the muscles are very important. But this is different now. If we look at someone standing up, and this is a left leg as you face it, their thigh muscles are pulling up on the kneecap, and their tendon is pulling down, up and down, into the groove. But actually, they're not in line with each other. So there is a force that's pushing the kneecap sideways. But the geometry is such that it can resist that. So that's good. The geometry is still strong enough to resist. It has a deep groove. And this is an X-ray of that kneecap. An X-ray, and that's the thigh bone. And the problem with this is that this isn't the whole story. There's a layer of stuff on top of your bones called articular cartilage, which allows the surfaces to have a frictionless rubbing relative to one another. There isn't a gap like that. They're in contact. But is the cartilage equidistant between those two, or does it have some kind of different thicknesses? Because if a clinician says you've got a problem with your kneecap, does an X-ray, and assesses the depth of this groove by this angle based on the bone, that actually isn't the articulation of the cartilage, which is the important thing. So this was a study I was involved with that Yifen Shi did as part of her PhD, where she actually measured this angle on the thigh bone, on the cartilage, and on the bone. And interestingly, if we go down on this graph, that's a deep groove, and that's good. So the bony depth of this structure is deeper than the actually cartilaginous one. So when people take an X-ray and they assess the function of your kneecap, they're not actually seeing the actual depth of that groove. And so it's important to get it right. So in fact, you need to do other imaging where you don't just see the bone, you also see the cartilage. Okay, one small anatomical study on the glenohumeral joint. If you recall, you've got this sphere articulating on this flat surface. But actually, this flat surface has a ring of stuff around it called a labrum. And it sort of deepens this flat surface, which provides you with a bit more stability. Possibly, you can hypothesize. So we thought we'd look at this structure and find out what it was made of. It's made of stuff that looks like articular cartilage on its surface. So that's good for rubbing. Perfect. Well, that's obvious because one bone rubs against it. But the main stuff, this is part of Adam Hill's PhD, consists of these parallel fibers that run all the way around it. And these are these fiber bundles. And that suggests that when you squeeze it, it resists in tension like this. So, hypothesis on function. Let's test it. We'll talk about that in a moment. So we're on our next history slide. We've built on Vesalius. And approximately 40 years after he published his anatomical work, Galileo went to Pisa to study medicine. Galileo never finished medicine. He was a really difficult character. And he didn't make many friends by questioning everything that he was taught. So in the end, he went to a far better institution, the greatest institution at the time. He went to Padua and became professor of mathematics there. But he made important contributions that move us beyond anatomical studies to load-bearing studies. He showed us how the bones are shaped to resist load. So he related structure to function in some way. And so the next step in the journey in this lecture is to look at the load-bearing nature of the structures that we've just looked at and how they function in the joint. Galileo took a few decades to follow Vesalius to Padua, and I was dragged back to Padua. I voluntarily went to Padua a few years later. Here I am beginning to use my own legs. Like Galileo, I detoured via Pisa. I couldn't be pushed around anymore, although you can see that my formative influences are still present. That is me there, by the way. And this is one of Galileo's images on the scaling of bone, how shape relates to load bearing for different sizes of animals. So we've gone from stability factors to some anatomical works now to looking at how they deform and their properties. So, an elastic band. How does an elastic band work? Well, you pull it apart and you measure how hard you have to pull it apart for how hard it stretches, right? Like in this little video here. So what do you have to measure? Load and stretching. So you maybe put dots on the surface and do videos of that. That's a basic technique. So we did this for the 3 structures of the medial collateral ligament. And there were some interesting results that were found here. This was part of James Robinson's Master of Surgery degree. He found that the superficial medial collateral ligament, the long thin one, was as strong and stiff as everybody had previously said the whole structure was. Why was that? Well, they probably weren't able to separate them out into their different parts and then pull them apart appropriately along their line of action. And it was a difficult experiment to do. The second important finding here was that this structure that goes round the back, the posterior medial capsule, was also just about as strong in and of itself, and yet it's a very different structure. So we think it can resist twisting of the knee, and now we know it's strong and stiff enough to do so. Just to point out how we measured displacement, this is clamped on a machine, and we measure the displacement of the machine. That's important in a minute. We now go back to these meniscofemoral ligaments that attach this structure called the meniscus around the back of the knee here. These are difficult because they attach to bone on one side and to this structure called the meniscus on the other. And you can't just clamp onto the meniscus. You have to freeze it in a freezing jaw here. And you can't just measure the deflection of the machine because it slips. So you have to put a barbed structure into the ligament here called a DVRT. So we're using slightly different techniques, but it's the same idea. But in this one, we also measured the material properties. And to measure the material properties, you have to measure the cross-sectional area as well. So we use silicone rubber to mold it, and then we measure the cross-sectional area of the cast without destroying the structure, and then pulling it apart. Interesting findings here. We found that this structure's material properties were generally stiffer than most other ligaments in the knee. Okay, if you think of this idea of tethering, you stretch it, and it resists the movement at some point. But if you have something like a cord that's much tighter and stiffer, it's resisting the movement in a more vigorous way. So it probably has a slightly different function. More of that in a moment. And then to go on to more experimental development, the labrum of the shoulder. And this is the structure, and we cut it up into sections. This was difficult, right? It's a very small little structure, and you have to cut it into little specimens that you can then pull and push. And we pulled them apart and measured the tensile modulus of this structure all the way around. Nothing interesting to say there. It's pretty consistent all the way around. But in compression, it was much stiffer on one part of the joint than on the other. And again, this time we changed the experimental protocol to do it in simulated body conditions. So that's humid environment at body temperature. So why is that interesting? Well, maybe it resists compression more than tension in that area. And so we think that helps us to understand the function of that part of the joint. Of course, we know that we all do our activities at different rates. Some of us run quicker than others. Sometimes when we're tackled, we have a high loading rate on our tissues. And so it's important for us to quantify these tissue properties not only at the slow loading rate that we saw for those tissues a minute ago, but actually at faster loading rates. And you have to devise techniques to do that, and this is using a drop rig here in this building, actually. And it's a slowed down high-speed video. And these are just some taster results showing that this is pulling it apart at a certain rate, and this is pulling it apart 10 times faster. And if you pull it apart 10 times faster, it's stiffer. Right? So if we go back to our analogy of the ligaments and the elastic band and the string, it's now more like a string, it's more like a cord. When you pull it apart faster, it gets stiffer. Okay, that tells us something about its function under high loading. Next bit of history. Vesalius taught us about anatomy, and Galileo helped us to see how structures can bear load. And I've shown how I've been involved in studies that have allowed us to quantify this load-bearing nature. About 50 years after Galileo, Borelli was born. Now, Borelli was a professor of mathematics in Rome. He eventually became a professor in Pisa. He never quite made it to Padua. Poor chap. He's important because he suggested And we all agree, right, that mechanics and not chemistry is the most important thing in the functioning of the human body. So I love Borelli. I think he's right. My students present here know that I believe that, and they know that it's true, or else. Anyway, what Borelli did, prior to Newton actually, is he really showed us how the musculoskeletal system functions like a system of levers. And we'll talk about that now. So my journey on the mechanics of joints now led me to Padua, St. Antony's, Padua, Antony there, without my sort of influences sitting around me, walking on my own 2 feet. This is the anatomy theatre, where you can do live anatomical dissections with a theatre, and these are people leaving their anatomy lesson in Padua, and that's where we did the studies. Doing some of the studies I'll present here. So, we've learnt a little bit about stability. We've looked at some anatomical features and how these resist load, and now we're going to talk about the function of joints. I'll just mention this. This is quite cute, actually. So this is one of Borelli's images. And if you look at this lever arm effect of the load and the joint reaction force on the knee, right? So that's the moment that it's the moment arm of that force about the knee joint, which is quite large. And if you stand on your tippy toes, you reduce it. So you change your knee loads just by standing on your tippy toes. So Borelli really understood this. Of course, it does something else at the hip, which might be more detrimental, but still, anyway, it might save your knee. So, what techniques do we use to understand how these structures work in tethering the movement of a joint? Because that's the story I'm telling you. So this is a knee, and it's like someone lying on their back with their shin level in the air with their thigh bone at an angle. So this is the shin. So what we do is they're resisting shearing of the joints, right? So what we do is we shear the joint, we pull it and push it, cut the structure, pull it and push it again and see what changes, and then maybe reconstruct it. And so this is the pushing-pulling machine and the twisting machine. And that's the kind of technology that we have to use, hanging weights off a disc. The results of this were quite interesting. They showed that this posterior medial corner, this part of the ligament that people hadn't previously really analysed or described, actually has a significant effect in resisting twisting of the knee. So it's not just tethering the flexion, but it's also tethering the twisting. That's very important. This story is not really about this ligament so much, but more about developing a new technology to understand function. So in the previous example, the knee was in one fixed angle of flexion, we were pushing and pulling. So then we had to develop a technique, measuring the motion using optical motion tracking, to flex and extend the knee over its whole range of motion, and push and pull it while it was flexing, to then measure the restraining or the tethering effect of these ligaments at all angles of flexion. And this resulted in a series of studies looking at the anterior cruciate ligament, other ligaments, and the effect of reconstructing them. And of course, measuring things in the operating theatre in the same way as well, by putting motion sensors on the bones themselves. So this is the shin bone being pushed backwards relative to the thigh bone. And received wisdom says that this structure, the posterior cruciate ligament, is the one that resists that. But what Chim found in his PhD was that, so this is pushing back, and this is the restraining force. So if you push with a certain force, you get a certain translation of the joint. That's a normal knee. If you cut the main ligament, the posterior cruciate ligament, you get more displacement. It pulls across even more. But these meniscofemoral ligaments actually functioned, importantly, to resist that motion. That wasn't previously described. That helps us to understand what they do. And in fact, if you injure the posterior cruciate ligament, it's not often reconstructed, because you've got these other structures that can scaffold and help that displacement. So that's an important indicator there. But that's only a small part of the story. So Chim then did an animal study. So this is let me check my notes. This is a dog, this is a sheep, and this is a horse. Looking at the back, this is the meniscofemoral ligament, and it looks pretty similar to the human. That's the cartoon of the human one. What's interesting is that this attaches to this meniscus structure, but the meniscus structure doesn't attach strongly to the shin bone in the way that the human one does. So it's different. This is the structure in the human bone that the meniscofemoral ligament attaches to. But this structure also attaches to the shin. So there's something different going on here in humans than in animals. And it came up with an idea on what this structure might do in addition to resisting this posterior displacement. It may be related to the function of this structure, the meniscus. So we need to look at the meniscus in a little bit more detail. So this is now looking on top of your shin bone, and imagine a cylinder rolling on top of a flat plate. That's what I've been telling you the thigh is like on the knee. That has line contact, doesn't it? So very high contact stresses, because you've only got a small area of contact. But if you have this meniscus structure interposed in between, it actually increases the contact area and moves with your rolling thigh bone. And the meniscofemoral ligaments attach to this. And when the bones are squeezed, the meniscus is squeezed out. And just like the labrum, it stretches in this way and produces stresses along its circumference, called hoop stresses. We tested this, whether or not the meniscofemoral ligaments actually functioned importantly in this way as well. So we came up with the hypothesis that meniscofemoral ligaments actually function in resisting that hoop stress, and they add to it, and they contribute to the kind of reducing the contact stress in the knee joint. And we found that they did, only by a small amount, by about 10%, but those of you who know a little bit about fatigue failure of materials, 10% may be important, right? Okay, let's go to a study on patellofemoral stability. Remember, this force that's pushing the kneecap sideways due to your muscles. We had to find a way of applying this cadaverically. We're not talking about ligaments now, we're talking about muscles. So we had to, this is a knee on its side, and these are the thigh muscles being loaded by strings hanging over pulleys. And then we can measure the motion, and that's screwed onto the kneecap. So the key issue is stability sideways, up and down. And so we had to come up with an experimental technique, this was part of Wong-Wit's PhD, to move the kneecap up and down, allow it to rotate and pivot so we could test the restraining force of it. We had to come up with a nice way of embedding a ball bearing in the middle of a kneecap and pushing and pulling it sideways. I really enjoyed this. This was great fun. We were constrained by the size of the kneecap here. Why is this important? Because some people have not much of a groove in their thigh bone. In fact, this should be a groove. It's very flat. So now this technique can be used to assess the effect of this thing called trochlear dysplasia and how you can then reconstruct it surgically. And so this is just demonstrating that you have an intact knee, you have a dysplastic knee that's not nearly so stable, and then you can do this surgery to it that brings it back to normal. So just developing a simple experimental technique allows you to do that kind of a study. They do other things. Marcus is here. I don't know where he is. Lovely to see you. This was Marcus's work. It's part of his MS, measuring the movement of the kneecap in the operating theatre. They don't just change the shape of that groove to make it deeper. What they sometimes do is they change the line of action of the tendon on the shin so that it's not pulling the kneecap sideways anymore. And so we could measure the effect of that using this technique and also in the operating theatre. So, we've just been learning about functional anatomy, or the biomechanics of these tissues. And it was a result of this work and others that I was asked to contribute to Gray's Anatomy. The 150th anniversary edition of this work included for the first time work on the text on the biomechanics of the knee. And I'm really proud of this. And I was involved with Andrew Amos on this. Absolutely fantastic. And that resulted from a lot of the work that was presented previously. So biomechanics of the knee is now in Gray's Anatomy. History lesson, last bit of the history lesson. Isaac Newton was born in the year that Galileo died, about 35 years after Borelli, and he formulated the laws of motion in the 17th century that now form the basis for our understanding of the mechanics of movement, right? And so now I'm going to show how we use them to the structures of the tissues, of the joints that we've just seen, and where I think this is leading to in the coming years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my research and then where I think this is going as we finish. And there's no tenuous link that I could find between Newton and Padua. Sorry. There is a tenuous link between Newton and Pisa. Some people have suggested that he dropped things off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And we all know that's rubbish. We all know Galileo probably didn't do it either, but it's more likely to have been him than anyone else. I've also been leading up to moving out of the normal support from my four sisters. Having demonstrated that I could get to Padua on my own and forging a career in academia and understanding Newton's second law of motion, I found myself investigating the dynamics of joints. So we've moved from the stabilizing effect to their anatomy, how they resist load, what their function is in static motion of the joints, and then now we're talking about the dynamics of joints, joints during movement, during activity in living people. So I took this little picture a little while ago of me holding a dumbbell like this. And so this is just a very simple example to explain how high the forces are in your joints. Okay, so this is a dumbbell force. I'm not saying how heavy it is, I don't want to put you to shame. And then there are muscles resisting that, yeah, pulling it up. And there's a joint that's tethered well by the ligaments, so everything can rotate about that joint. So this needs to be in some form of equilibrium in rotation, yeah? So that force times that distance must equal that force times that distance. And the distance that the muscles are from the center of rotation is much less than the external load that I'm applying. So the force in my biceps muscles, substantial ones here, are 6 times the force I'm carrying, approximately. So this is just to demonstrate the lever arm effect. It's like a seesaw, right? Yeah, big fat person close to the pivot point is balanced by a very light person far away. And then we have other forces in the joints that arise out of this large muscle force. So we have large muscle forces, large joint forces, shear loading that requires tethering by the ligaments, so we have large loading in the ligaments as well. So when we're interested in dynamics, we're interested in what the loading is during activity. So the input is how the joints are moving, what their shape is, what their deformation properties are, and what the external loading is. And what we can find out from this is what the muscle forces are, what the tissue loading is, and how stable the joints are. And then we can do some interventions. We can use this to do interventions. So we go back to Newton, and we find out how we measure those things. So this is a pipeline. You'll have this slide a few times. The pipeline is measuring things, doing some maths, quantifying forces on the tissues at the end. Okay? Measuring, doing some maths, quantifying what's happening to the tissues at the bottom. So we'll talk about movement first, kinematics. And this is a technology we use a lot. This is called optical motion tracking. And in optical motion tracking, we stick reflective markers, infrared cameras. We measure their position in space with multiple cameras, and we measure people doing activities of motion. And these are the reflective markers. Of course, the reflective markers don't tell you actually how the skeleton is moving. They tell you how the skin is moving, which often follows the movement of the skeleton. But for some joints, you need to be really careful, like the shoulder. Back to the glenohumeral joint. The shoulder blade actually slides under the skin, and there's large relative movement between these. So we have to track that. This is using a locator, first developed by Garth Johnson, and we've kind of moved it on a bit from there. And we use some other devices to measure shoulder movement. And this is Alia, who's sitting here as part of her PhD, tracking someone's shoulder as they're raising their arm, tracking their shoulder blade. If you're not interested in tracking things on the surface, you screw things into the bones, right? So you can do that in the operating theatre quite easily, but you may not want to do it in the clinic. These motion sensors measure the motion of in space. So you might need to devise clever clamps, just a bit of engineering design, that track the movement of the skeleton but aren't influenced by the surface movement of the skin. And so this is now being applied in a clinical study in Italy. They're also applying some torque to the leg to measure twisting response of some ligaments, bit of fun. And that was Pierluigi's PhD. You also need to measure external forces as part of this pipeline to understand what's happening. External forces, so the weight you're carrying. And the way people normally do this during sort of normal activities, during, let's say, walking, is putting a force plate on the floor, and this is in Alison McGregor's lab at Charing Cross. You put the reflective markers on the skin, and you measure force at the feet, or going up and down stairs. So there are force plates in here, and this is the line of action of the force. Or even when you get up out of a seat, it's not just what's happening at your behind and at your feet. It's actually how you push off that's important, because it influences your arms' function as well. So this is part of Dominic's postdoc. He's been instrumenting seats and measuring load at the seat and at the hands. And this is part of research that I've been involved in with GB Rowing, British Rowing, I think it's called now, and Alison McGregor at Charing Cross for many years. And it's exactly the same thing. We have to measure the external force. Where is the external force? It's at your hands, it's at your seat, and it's at the feet. So you measure at the hands. This is a little wireless thing that we devised. This is just a little sketch, but actually this has now been made, so we're measuring force at the feet. and this is an instrumented seat. So we're able to measure all the force inputs to the human body, and we're measuring the motion using electromagnetic motion sensors. We then use Newtonian mechanics, so Newton comes back into play, and we find out what the muscle and joint reaction forces are. And in the traditional formulation of a musculoskeletal model, the parts of interest are modelled as a set of rigid links, and then we consider them all separately, and we say what the loads on them are. So there's weight, they each weigh something, and there's maybe a ground reaction force here at the foot. They also accelerate, and F equals ma, remember, so we have to measure the acceleration, either in translation or in rotation, so we add that to our measurement. We then have some unknowns. There's a joint reaction force there that's an unknown, it's another force, and then we look at the anatomy, the ligaments, the deep muscles, and the muscles coming up. So we have to add them as unknown variables in our model. So now we can use Newtonian mechanics. We sum the forces, we sum the moments, and we can get a solution to what the muscle forces are. Pretty straightforward. But there are too many unknowns for the number of equations we have. So how do we find a solution? Well, there are lots of different ways, and this is problematic, right? One way is we say, well, the muscles can only work between a certain amount. They have a certain limit, that's fair. We use some kind of a cost function, and we do a mathematical optimization. But the two fundamental issues in this kind of a model are how you describe the anatomy, where these muscles insert, what their moment arm is relative to the center of rotation of the joint, how they wrap around other structures, and what mathematical formulation you use for solving this problem. So first on anatomy, there's just a couple of points on anatomy. These two models are used frequently. These are your gluteal muscles. And you can see, these are based on dissection studies. You can see that the lines of action of these muscles are totally different in these two models. And they certainly come up with a different prediction of the forces. So there's a problem there. And we found that we had to do a much better job around the knee, particularly to get a solution to this problem. The second key anatomical related problem is how you model the ligaments. Now in this type of model, normally, the ligaments are modelled and understood purely as resisting the shear of the joint, the tethering effect. That's fine, we understand that, I've just explained that. But actually the ligaments only act purely in tethering if they cross the centre of rotation, if they don't have a moment arm relative to the centre of rotation. If they have a moment arm relative to the centre of rotation, they also act as a force actuator to twist or to flex or whatever. And so you have to include that in your model. I think we're the first to have included that. This is Dan Cleather's PhD, to include the restraining effect due to the shape of the geometry of the joints and the ligaments and the muscles simultaneously to better quantify loading at the knee. Okay, in the mathematical, this wasn't me. In the mathematical formulation, there are also two other issues that I want to explain. One is biarticular muscles. So your hamstring muscles cross both the knee and the hip. They don't just cross the knee. So if you contract your hamstring muscles, they cause the leg to flex and the hip to straighten like that. And when this chap was jumping, his hip was straightening, so his hamstring muscles would help that, but his leg was straightening, so the hamstring muscles would act against that. So biarticular muscles that cross two joints are really problematic in these models. They don't just do one thing. They act against the activity. And so how you formulate that's important. Of course, their moment arm at these different joints might be different, so they might have a differential effect. Anyway, we've been able to look at that. The biggest issue I would suggest, my sister's got all the glory up to now, so my little brother gets in here as well. There's this issue of co-contraction, and this is really unresolved, I would say. So, when you're holding something very precious, see how I got the link there? When you're holding something very precious, you might brace yourself tight, or you might be relaxed. So I took this picture not long ago, and what I'm doing is I'm bracing my arm. Now you can imagine the dynamics of that activity to the external world look the same if I'm relaxed or if I really contract tight. Right? The forces are obviously different, right? But I've measured the movement, I've measured the external load, I've put in the anatomy, I've done my mathematical formulation, and I've come up with one solution of the muscle forces. And yet you and I know that if I contract more tightly, I have multiple solutions. So that's a fundamental issue with these types of models. And you have to find a way around that. A few quick examples at the end of how we now predict how we use this technology to look at tissue stresses. And this is more videos and more fun for you. So we're interested in how muscles work during climbing. And we've been able to implement that. This is originally from the Newcastle shoulder model, developed by Garth and Ian Charlton. And we've been able to implement that and start looking at how you might train better for this, but also how you might do certain activities to better climb. Okay, this is a study. The kinematic study was done here in Ravenscourt Park Hospital in orthopedics, where the motion was measured, and then the guys in Newcastle implemented it in their musculoskeletal model of the upper limb to look at the function of the implant. This doesn't look like the ball and socket we saw earlier on because the implant's a bit funny here. And in fact, they used this to design a new implant. So it shows that this kind of technology can be used. Of course, we don't know how good the implant is, but Garth can tell us about it later. And then this, I started working with Alison on the rowing in 1999, I recall. Amazing. So we're measuring all the external loads. We're measuring the motion using electromagnetic sensors stuck to the body. And we're modeling the forces going on in the body, particularly at the lower back and particularly at the knee. And this is a study that's been used as part of the research, but also training program for the elite athletes of the British rowing team. This has been fantastic fun. This is Andy Murphy, and it's part of his PhD. Not good camera man, I'm sorry. But also, what he's doing here is he's measuring their muscular contraction forces. And from that, we can come up with an upper limit, an upper bound in our model of what they can actually produce. I love this. This is Theophano's PhD work. I absolutely love this. It's such good fun. Cricket may not be important to you, but there are more than 1 billion people in India for whom this is really important. Okay? This chap is bowling the ball. And according to the laws of the game, you're not allowed to straighten or bend your arm during bowling, right? But you need to be able to measure it somehow. So Theophano worked very hard. This is the indoor school at Lords. The MCC are the custodians of the game of cricket, and they funded this work, looking at actually the best way to measure and the best way to quantify how the elbow is moving. And so that's put in the model. But the graph at the bottom is the interesting one. That's the same ball, that's the same path of motion, but the actual elbow flexion or extension that happens from the start of ball delivery to the ball being released is different, depending on the way you quantify it, depending on the maths you use. That's fundamentally important, because this person would be called for chucking, for throwing, and his livelihood would be gone, and there would be some international problem with that. And this person, according to the laboratory experiments, if they were analysed in that way, would be told, oh yes, you're fine, you're not chucking the ball. Of course, only one of those actually theoretically is right. So, this is my vision. Jimmy comes into the clinic, this is me in my office, saying, I just want to sit down and stand up. Could you tell me if my joints are healthy, or can you tell me my knee hurts? What can I do? You then measure things and you implement it in your model. You then apply your muscle forces to your deformation model of the knee, and you look at how the stresses are distributed through the key structures. So that's theory, but we're getting very close to being able to do that. And that's where this work is leading. What can you do with that? Well, you can tell people to walk differently. You can design artificial replacements of that. Or you can even put insoles in to get them to walk differently so that the stresses on their knee are reduced, so their joint lasts a bit longer. Okay, the final application area is in sort of higher loading activities. This is an extreme loading activity, an improvised explosive device blowing up underneath a vehicle. No gore, don't worry, no gore here. So what happens when it goes off? You get a massive, very fast deformation of the floor pan of the vehicle, right? Shooting up your leg, and you get injured. Can you use musculoskeletal dynamics to analyze how that happens and to analyse whether or not you can mitigate that, put a different boot on, design the vehicle differently. So we've been using the same techniques and technologies that we've been describing all the way up to now in looking at mitigating that for civilian and military application. But do you believe anything I've just told you, right? Because I told you about co-contraction, and you all said, yeah, I believe you. That doesn't make sense. Yes, you don't have a unique solution here. It's a load of rubbish. So we need to validate, right? Well, you can validate a little bit for muscle activations. You can measure muscle activations using EMG. So there are other things strapped to this girl's legs, measuring the electrical activity of her muscles. So you can predict muscle forces, but you can also measure the electrical activity. Aha! I can now calibrate for this co-contraction issue, right? Perhaps. But take this as an example. What if you could pop something into a tendon and actually directly measure muscle force? Wouldn't that be good? You pop the thing in, you put a load cell on one side and you pull it. So the bone is on the right, the tendon is across the middle, and the muscle's on the left, pulling hard. And you apply a force to that tendon, and you get the buckle gauge squeezes with a strain gauge on it, and you measure a response. And then you take your clamp device out, you leave the buckle in, you wake them up, and you get them to move around. Then you've got a direct measure of muscle force, and you can use your models, and you can validate them. Can be done. So this is Peter Riley putting one in the operating theatre. There's the device. It's pretty small. That's what it looks like when it's in. That's the retrieval suture, so you can put it out again when they're awake through the hole that you popped it in. That's the device we had to design so that it could be sterilised, so that you could measure load in the operating theatre, right? Sorry, is this too gory for you? We'll move on quick. This is it being calibrated when they're asleep. And then the bloody picture, sorry about that, is when they're awake and they're moving their arm and we're directly measuring muscle force. So you can actually validate these models directly. There are other ways of validating things. So our models of the lower limb in blast, we need to create an experimental capacity to simulate that floor pan deformation very quickly. And this is us applying it in the rig, in the lab, to a cadaver leg and actually deforming it very quickly. So we've created the experimental capacity to do that. And so the validation of our models is then that the smashed up heel bone that we get in the lab is the same as the smashed up heel bone that we predict in our mathematical model. So that's the first form of validation. There is a second form of validation, because sadly we have real clinical data from the field, from people who've been blown up, and I think this is pretty astounding. That heel bone fracture and that heel bone fracture, pretty much the same. So it suggests that our experimental capacity now can recreate what happens clinically. Okay, I'm just about finished. So at the end of this hour, you've heard a little bit of my own history and of where the research has taken me and where I think it can go. You really can predict muscle forces and how these are transmitted through the body, and then look at stresses on joints. And I think it's fun and interesting, and it's a great career that I'm having. But I also think it's possibly important. So the demographic time bomb is such, we're all going to get older, and there are more people who are going to get older. And the two key clinical conditions facing the Western world are dementia, predominantly Alzheimer's. It's going to be a big problem at some point in the future. I know nothing about it, and I'm not doing anything to do with that, so we'll park that for now. The second condition, wait for this, it's probably something to do with what I'm doing, is musculoskeletal conditions, particularly osteoarthritis and osteoporosis, and musculoskeletal pain. So I actually think, fundamentally, the work I'm doing is important. It may be fun, but it's also important. And these people think it is as well, because they've funded it. And I think other people have had fun as well. And I want to thank you all very personally, in a heartfelt way, for sharing this journey with me. I'm really honoured to have had a fantastic department to work in, my heads of department, Dick, Chris, John Lever, sadly dead, Ross, Chris Hankin, who was in loco parentis for a short while. These people have all really supported me personally, and you all have as well. And I leave here with a slide of students. And why do I leave with a slide of students? Because as I'm continually reminded by one of my close colleagues, how will you have the most significant impact in your life? Okay, I mean, I see people on the front row here on whom I have a significant impact. I hope it's beneficial. But I also see these undergraduate students, these graduates who've come through our department, and clearly they're going to do greater things than I ever can, all of them. And so actually I want to thank them. And many of you are here. It's fantastic to see some of my former and current undergraduate students here. And I especially want to honour and thank my two closest collaborators. A lot of the knee work was definitely done with Andrew Amos, and a lot of the rowing work and other musculoskeletal dynamics work is done with Alison McGregor. They've done really well to sort of stick with me for all these years, and I want to thank them in a heartfelt way. My final Oscar thanks are to these infrequent visitors to work who help me to get up in the morning, feed me and water me and that kind of stuff, and really help me to have the right perspective on all that I do. Thank you very much.